Welcome to Buckets. My name's Matt Moore. I'm the senior NBA writer for the Action Network, and this is your How to Bet Coach of the Year. We're going to break down in detail how to bet Coach of the Year, what the thresholds are for the various people that have won the award. We'll get a look at how to bet it. Do you want to bet on the team or do you want to bet on Coach of the Year? We'll do all of that and more on today's show. And to do that, I've got with me Jim Turvey at Turvey Bets on Twitter and the Action Network app, and Bryan Fonseca at Bryan Fonseca NY on Twitter. They're going to help me out because they have the best ideas for this award. They signed up. They were very excited. And as we were talking today, they got even more excited as we prepared for this episode. We'll have great bets for you. As a reminder, everything we talk about can be found in the award-winning Action Network app. Best way for you to track your picks. You're going to get one of the cool things is you actually get, like, you can go into your bet history and do analysis so you can figure out, like, how am I doing on totals? How am I doing on spreads? All those types of things so you can get a better sense for how your bets are doing. I think it's a really great feature. All of our live shows pop up in there, so you're not going to miss a live show, which you can also catch at youtube.com/The Action Network. Make sure to sign up there, not only to watch Buckets, but to watch WNBA Buckets. I did the playoff preview with Jim Turvey. That was a lot of fun. You're going to catch Best Bets episodes throughout the playoffs. For that, you can catch Brandon Anderson on all of the NFL pods that he does. All sorts of great stuff in there as well. Make sure to check it out in the Action Network app. All right. Let's not dilly-dally. Let's not mess around because these guys have not told me their best bets for Coach of the Year. I am entering into this with currently, I will talk about it. There are guys I want to consider. There's people I'm interested in betting, but I don't have any best bets right now. We'll talk about why, and we'll talk about, like, I'm waiting to hear these two and for them to convince me to talk me into some truly probably stupid bets for Coach of the Year. I'm excited for it. Bryan Fonseca, tell me what your best bets are for Coach of the Year 2025.
I have a lot of people I want to consider.
Just the best bets, man. And then later I'll let you on.
I know. There's a lot of people I want to consider. There's two that I'm going to get to later. But in terms of best bets, I will play it relatively safe and say Rick Carlisle, Indiana Pacers.
Okay. All right. There's a 30-1 on Carlisle in the market currently. Jim, what are your best bets for Coach?
Same as Bryan. Bunch of chat about two I'm going to pull out here as a best bet. I'm going to go Quin Snyder, of course, my beloved Hawks, 40-1. And the one I think maybe I can talk you into, Mike Budenholzer, 25-1 at
When he told me that there was one I wasn't going to like, I assumed that it was actually going to be Budenholzer because I've talked a lot about how, like, I'm not crazy about the Budenholzer stuff. I'm getting talked into it as we get closer. But yeah, look, I think Quin Snyder is an amazing coach, but we'll talk about my issues with that a little bit later on. This has been brewing for a while. I've been waiting to have this knockdown drag out with Jim Turvey for a minute. So we'll see how this goes. All right. I want to go ahead and revisit who wins this thing. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'll ask the guys kind of some archetypes for who they're looking to bet, right? I pulled some numbers. Last 15 seasons, I think, is a very good indication. Like, that's a very good sample where it's a little bit beyond the pace and space era, but it kind of starts. Like, if you ask me, actually 09 is the start of the pace and space era. Most people will credit the Warriors. I actually go back to the Orlando Magic around Dwight Howard. It was heavy pick and roll with a lot of 3-point volume shooters around them. So that's like a good start to me for where we go. And we do last 15 seasons. The average wins for Coach of the Year, 57.3. I was like, that seems high. What if we take out the Steve Kerr 73 win Warriors? Nope, still 56. So if you kind of look at this, most of these are 50 plus. Most of them are 55 plus. If we're going to be real with you, there are a couple that you can kind of slide into here. Like Mike Brown won 2 years ago with 48 wins. Thibodeau won 41 in the 66 win year. I don't know what that translation is. I could do the math, but I'm not gonna. But it was not outside of the boundaries of what we're kind of used to. And everybody else is pretty much flat 50 wins or more. And you need to be like, if you win 55 plus, you have a really good chance of winning Coach of the Year. One of the interesting things I found, because I find it to be a great guiding post for this award, is what was your win total going into the season? Because it's a great combination of, did you win a shit ton of games? Were you expected to only win a little bit? Okay, then you're Coach of the Year. The average win total for Coach of the Year in the last 15 seasons, 44.6 is where that comes out to. So we're looking for teams that are below kind of that. If you're talking about win totals, some of the key numbers I've found during the research I've done over the last 13 years historically, the key numbers are 47.5, 50, 52.5. Those are key numbers when we look at 50 at win totals. A lot of teams wind up at that threshold and not going below or starting out there and staying there. So we're looking for below the 47.5, but over 500. Like, it's very rare that you're expected to be a sub 500 team and you win enough games because that's too big of a jump. It's basically you're expected to be a little bit over 500 and you won way over 500 in that 55 plus range. The average difference between your win total and what you actually won for Coach of the Year, 12.7. So you're expected to win about 13 games more, or you wound up winning about 13 games more than you were expected to by the numbers. And finally, I only have data back to 2015 via Sports Odds History. I did pull the price though. The average price preseason for Coach of the Year is 30-1. Rick Carlisle, by the way, is 30-1. The lowest that we've seen was Steve Kerr in 2016. He was plus 575 when they wound up winning, 73 games. And then actually last year was the second lowest that we've seen. It was Mark Daigneault, who was plus 700 to win this award, which I was not surprised at. He was like, there's a lot of like, hey, the Thunder could be really good, and Daigneault's thought to be really good. The longest was Mike Brown with the Kings at 80-1. Mike Brown's win actually broke a lot of markers where he was 80-1, which is outside of most of what we've seen. Tom Thibodeau also in 21 was 80-1. But anyway, Brown was higher and only won 48 games less.
And he had a bad defense
so
too, and defense is secretly part of it too.
Okay, well, let's get into that. So, Jim, I want to ask you, and you can kind of use this because you've got Brandon Anderson's handy dandy rules that he always pulls out, and he'll talk about this when he does awards. What's the archetype of the candidate that you're looking to bet? And tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I saw this question on the rundown, and I read it at first as like literally that I look to bet. And now there's like the bets that we always find ourselves going back to as bettors. And then there's the bets where we sit down, analyze, and are like, these are the smart things. I think Brian and I will both have ones where like, I'm drawn to this person, but this is the smart bet. And so I read it as the archetype that I am drawn to. And I find myself very often going to the teams that have a really high ceiling that I'm kind of like on their island this year. So it's like the Pistons Island, me and you in lockstep on Pistons Island. That's not what we actually should be doing, but that's the people I find myself drawn to. Quin Snyder kind of is in that mold. He's definitely closer to the Mike Brown breaking this rule of, being in the 40s and not the 50s potentially for a win total. But I find myself, I keep coming back to those like kind of really out of nowhere candidates instead of the ones who I think we really should be targeting. You mentioned that you ran through a bunch of numbers that do overlap with what Brandon said. Brandon's rules are you want to target someone who is going to be able to improve by about a dozen wins from the year before, someone who's going to beat their preseason win total by about a dozen wins, which knocks out the most amount of candidates, including a lot of the favorites. So if you're going through this, Joe Mazzulla at some books is the favorite. If you think they're winning 12 more games than their preseason projected total, just bet them to, win 70 plus games at an insane number instead of Joe Mazzulla at plus 1,000 for Coach of the Year. There's better ways to do that. So the archetype that I'm drawn to is very often these like fully out of nowhere candidates. Those are a lot harder to find. And to be honest, they don't win as much. So I think what we should be looking for, you laid out perfectly. It's someone whose win total is in the low 40s. Maybe you can get away with high 30s. It's someone who is coming off a season in which they, it's not someone who they won. One name that I find very interesting who I want to at least talk about, but the San Antonio Spurs, because the preseason win total projection is already baking in about 12 wins of improvement, they'd have to jump by 20 plus wins or something. That's going to be really difficult to do. So you need to kind of thread that needle of a dozen wins over last year, a dozen wins over preseason total, and then you want to have that end up in around the mid 50s, but honestly the high 50s. You mentioned that like outside of a few key names, it really is high 50s. So for me, I find myself drawn to certain types, but then I'll sit down, crunch the numbers, and land on a few who are better in the path that we really should be following for this award.
Yeah, I mean, I think last year was easy because Dags got the number one seed in the West with 57 wins with the youngest roster in the league. And every coach in the league would talk about, like, God, that team's a pain in the ass to play. Like, it was just very, like, that was an easy one, honestly, I think, for the voters to go that way. Without that this year, right? Because it's harder to go back to back. And we don't see anybody in the last 15 years go back to back. Like, it doesn't happen. In part because we talked about, like, exceeding expectations. So if you did it last year, you're kind of expected to go ahead and do it again. So that, I think, is like an interesting way to look at it. Bryan, when you think about the archetypes that you're looking to bet for this award, what are you looking for?
So you mentioned 50, and you also mentioned 55 wins. The number to me was 55. The percentage to me is basically 67% of your games. So 16 of the last 20 Coach of the Years won 67% of their games that season. It's 14 of the last 20 that got 55, but 2 of those were lockout years where we had a guy who would have won 55 games because of pace and things of that nature, if not for, the lockout of 2012, of, COVID. We shouldn't call that one a lockout. The league was just straight up suspended, for very important reasons. And then overachieving teams where it has to be somebody, and I mentioned Rick Carlisle at the top of this. I kind of have to think, because the Pacers are in that 46, 47 range. If I'm looking at Rick Carlisle as an example, I kind of have to be like, the Pacers can get the 1 or the 2 seed in the Eastern Conference, which is feasible because you're basically looking at, hey, can they get to 57 wins? Because over the last several years in the Eastern Conference, 57 wins gets you the 1 or the 2 seed. It's plausible that happens. Jim talked about defense being a key to this. We've also seen offense do this with Mike D'Antoni a couple different times. The Pacers are kind of, and this is not as a slight, but built to succeed in the regular season. And building off what they did last year, that's sort of a marker for me that was drawn to me, so to speak. Like, oh, okay, the Pacers can punch above their weight here. It's hard to determine because a lot of these win totals, like, you can kind of go back and forth with. But to me, I'm trying to identify who are the great teams, the truly great ones that even the year Phoenix won, they were a 64-win team. And Phoenix, had the Coach of the Year that season with Monty Williams, but their over-under was 51. So they were able to punch above their weight to the degree where they had 13 more wins basically than expected. So you have to kind of look at that, like who's going to be great in the regular season and who's going to be overwhelming. There are certain instances where that's different because you mentioned the Knicks in 2021 with Tom Thibodeau. And I also have this theory about like fresh candidates and revival candidates, but we can get to that later. But the revival candidate there was Tom Thibodeau, who the reason why they won, or he won Coach of the Year rather, despite being 41-31 short in season and only winning 57% of their games, ultimate outlier, their over-under was 21.5. And also being the Knicks probably helps. Like they had the 4 seed, they had, home court advantage in the Eastern Conference in the first round of the playoffs, those type of things. Like going that far above. And then with Mike Brown, it's also like, he was another revival candidate where he's the fresh candidate who wins Coach of the Year in 2009 with the Cavs. But then with the Kings, it's like, we never think the Kings are going to be good. And their over-under was 34.5. They get 48 wins. And it's like, he's like, that franchise is so bad historically, lately at least. And he was able to do that. Like, those are sort of the outliers that you could look at also. But it's generally like great teams and just overwhelming, unexpected success.
Yeah, I think ceiling is I think the really key thing to kind of go back to. And then Jim mentioned this of, you need a team that's going to outdo expectations. I think it's easier, though, from a betting perspective to find value. I think it's easier to just kind of look at, okay, no one's expected to win 60. The Boston Celtics win total is 58.5. It got bet up at 57.5, right? And like, they're 60 is not light work for them, right? There's a lot of reasons to think it's going to be tough, but they have a really good shot at that. And the book could only get it up to 57.5. Like, that's why I was a pass on it, because I was like, there's a lot of reasons for regression, but their floor is so damn high. They might just win 55, and then I'm sweating at the end on this number, which is kind of funny that Joe Mazzulla is not a like no one thinks that's like a serious candidate, which would be kind of funny if he would defy a lot of rules for winning the championship and then winning Coach of the Year, for winning as many as he did last year and then getting it the year after, because you can't imagine they're going to win like 75 or whatever. So what you're talking about is we think they're good, but we don't think they're great, and they wound up having the regular season record of a great team.
Right.
Like that's a pretty easy model to kind of get there. Now, I think the trick gets into, do you have an MVP candidate player? If you win 73, you can get there, right? Because like 2016, you win the most games in NBA history. You can get MVP and Coach of the Year at the same time. But most of the time, like when we look back at these awards, if we just run down this list, Shea finished second, an MVP, but did not have the MVP. And I do kind of wonder, like, there's a synergy there of like, you had a guy that was good enough to get you there, but like he wasn't the winner. He wasn't the MVP. Oh, so we can give you Coach of the Year. I think it's very hard for them to give Coach of the Year and MVP to the same team. Again, unless you were just like, if you win 67 plus games, okay, we can start having that conversation. You're in the best teams of all time conversation for regular season. Let's talk about this. I'm interested in kind of some of the stuff you guys have mentioned. Just real quick. Jim, how do you decide if you want a team future or a Coach of the Year bet, or if you want both? Like, how do you parse out that? Because we do wind up in this thing where it's like, I really like this team, and so I can take their over minus 110, but I think they're going to go way over that. Should I play an alternate win total? But this is like Coach of the Year is a really good way to just kind of bet that what's usually a much longer.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most fun things about futures. This is like very much like that kind of puzzle game theory type thing where you look at a team that you're interested in and you say, all right, what are the ways I can approach betting this team? Is it a high floor, like you said with the Celtics? All right, regular season win total makes sense. Is there a narrative case to be made around a certain player with a certain award? Let's go that direction. One thing that I think is a factor for Coach of the Year is, are they in their first or second year? Brandon mentioned this in his article as well. If they're newer to the team, I think oftentimes that it does make an easier case. With the two names I threw out, Quin Snyder will now be his second full season. Bud is going to be in his first season with the Suns. If he comes in and that team takes off, they have a lot of the same roster. There's actually some really nice key pieces that they picked up, but those are not the big names that are going to be kind of driving the narrative. If the Suns take off this season, Durant will definitely get, he'll get his bona fide, he'll get his credit here and there. Booker might be a one who like takes a leap up into an MVP type conversation. But again, this was a roster that was pretty much the same, at least at the star level last year. They get a new coach and they win 10 more games. It's going to be a very easy narrative to come around and say, this coach who has had a lot of success in the past came to Phoenix and really turned things around. And, the narrative fits so well for that if you're looking at a team that you're interested in playing, the Suns are a team that I also like them to potentially be the number one seed. I think that's an interesting bet. But for Budenholzer at, 25-1 for this Coach of the Year, it could pay out. You could get that 25-1 even if they're the 2 seed. There's almost a bigger payout for a lower, ceiling outcome. They could finish below the Thunder. Say the Thunder win, 57, the Suns win 55. They don't even get that 1 seed that actually was, priced around the same price or a little bit even less than Budenholzer. But because he is such a strong narrative case and they're not having to go against even the Wolves, the Wolves are going to be, to get to this award for Chris Finch, they'd have to win, in the 60s because of what the bar they set last year. So you're getting the ability to buy out of some of the other good bets that are out there for this team and really center it around what is the key piece that was different than last year. So really it fits very well for that kind of approach to what is new for this team. It's a new coach. With the Hawks, it's a little bit less so Quinn did have last year, but I think he has kind of the respect and kind of the hipster. I feel like he is like an NBA hipster's dream coach. He's always being talked about as one of the best coaches and hasn't maybe gotten the credit. So when the narrative fits, this is one of those awards. If you're a narrative bettor, where you can definitely try to pull that out. Whereas other teams, it's just not necessary. It's never going to be, JJ Redick. If the Lakers do well, maybe he gets some credit because he is a first year coach. But LeBron's almost always going to be getting the credit when it comes to the Lakers. So you need to think about that narrative side of things and which, like you said, which bet makes sense with which team. Ceiling, floor, words we've used a bunch in this podcast already. All of those factors go into figuring out which is the best way to play the teams that you want to be on for the season.
Bryan, when you're looking at how to make those decisions. Is there anything else that you kind of try and parse through?
Just history, like in terms of, has the coach won Coach of the Year already?
Yeah.
Has the player won MVP already? If we're talking about certain teams, what kind of accolades the player has or the coach has? What's their playoff history? Because you have to also think of this like a voter. Like I do think some voters may take into account, hey, like, so what if they won 56 games this year and we projected them at 43 and a half? They didn't do shit in the playoffs the last 2 years and they had their opportunity. Not anyone in particular, but just as an example, like certain things could get held against guys. We talked about this a little bit on the Defensive Player of the Year episode. And it's just like, we do have to take into account the narrative because these awards are voted on, and basically all awards to some degree are going to be kind of narrative driven, right? So I look at history and I look at just the sort of freshness of the team, because I talked about like fresh candidates a little bit, and like there are going to be guys in new situations, and if you look at Coach of the Year, you kind of get a little bit of a bump. Like Tom Thibodeau the first time with Chicago, that was fresh, that was new. It was an early head coaching opportunity. It was in his first few years, within his first few years on the job. Even somebody like, Mark Daigneault, who just won last year, hasn't been a head coach for like that long. So those type of factors as well. Doc Rivers very early on in his career in 1999, 2000 with the Orlando Magic, who, by the way, was only a 500 team, but their over-under was also like in the low 20s. So they just punched above their weight so much where it didn't matter. Mike D'Antoni hadn't been a head coach that long, but by the time he won it when he was with the Phoenix Suns in 2004, 2005. So I also think you get a bump if this is new. This is harder to win as a repeat winner because it's only happened 11 times. Like, it'll be hard for Greg Popovich to do this again for what will be, I think, the fourth time in his career, if the Spurs, or unless the Spurs win like an absurd amount of games. And even then, we might be talking about Victor Wembanyama should be MVP as opposed to Greg Popovich winning Coach of the Year again.
You're going to have to give me a minute. We're recording this on Sunday night, and I had Seattle Storm +9, and they were tied at the half, and they were up by 1 after the third quarter, and they lost by 11, and I'm
unanimous came through.
I had Aces for me in the old Action Network app.
Had Aces -7.5. By the way, I think we swept best bets for game 1 on our best bets file. I think we swept every bet.
Good for you. No, that's awesome. That is genuinely awesome.
It's like 9 or 10 bets there. I think we swept all of them.
That's why they're on the best bets file and I'm not. All right. So there's some other questions I'd like to get to, but I actually want to dive into some of the candidates because I think this is, we need to get to the meat of it. Let's start with Fonseca. All right. I have a list of guys that fit the categories, and there's a name I'm thinking about actually as we go through this podcast. I think it's probably going to wind up being my best bet, who's not among these names. I'll run through these real quick. This is based off a win total range and where the price range is at historically. Jamal Mosley, 15-1 for the Orlando Magic. Mike Budenholzer, 25-1. Sacramento Kings, Mike Brown, which would be his third Coach of the Year award, 30-1. Rick Carlisle from Bryan Fonseca, 30-1. Taylor Jenkins does not qualify because he's +900, and that's actually too low. We usually see these guys with a longer number. It would be the third lowest that we've seen in the last 15 years. Willie Green of the New Orleans Pelicans, Brandon Anderson's favorite, 15-1. JJ Redick of the Los Angeles Lakers. Jim talked about him, about the LeBron problem, but he's 25-1. Spo's 20-1 because nobody thinks the Heat are going to do shit. Kerr's 30-1, which is interesting. And then the favorite is Ime Udoka at +850. He's also too short. You'll have a better opportunity later on Udoka. I will say, like, from a general timing thing, that one of the good things about Coach of the Year is like the market's really slow to react on this. There's not a lot of handle. There's not a lot of early season results are very indicative of where we go. By December, it was like, hey, the Nuggets and the Thunder and the Wolves are all the top 3 teams in the West. And everyone's like, yeah, we'll see. And then it was like, no, it was the Nuggets and the Wolves and the Thunder. And so you could have made bets based off of that. So just as a reminder, like, you can still get good numbers on Coach of the Year, not just early, not just mid-season, but late. You're still going to get pretty good numbers on these. Like, we still had pretty good numbers on Dagnall at the end of the season because it was thought to be kind of up in the air between him and Finch. And I honestly, the last 3 weeks of the season really did kind of dictate it. Like, whoever wound up with a 1 between Finch and Dagnall was probably going to get that. And whoever, if the Nuggets got 1, it was whoever got second. All right, Fonseca, talk to me about Carlisle. Make the case for why you like Rick here.
So my actual knee-jerk reaction for this award was like, all right, what's Kenny Atkinson's number? But then I was like, the past regular season success, already a couple years of this, might be held against them unless the Cavs are so overwhelmingly good that they get like 60 wins or something, and I don't necessarily see that. And I also think Donovan Mitchell for MVP is probably a better bet anyway, because that's like 1,000,000 to 1 or whatever it is. So then I looked at other teams, and I landed on Pacers because I think there's a world where if Tyrese Halliburton stays healthy, because that's sort of a key in this too, and he struggled with that last year, there's a world where they were even better in the regular season last year if he doesn't get hurt and slows down his production for, I don't know, what was that, weeks, months? 46.5 wins. Can the Pacers be second seed in the Eastern Conference in the regular season behind Boston, or even top them in wins? I don't think they're going to top the Celtics in wins, but is that inconceivable? I think at 30 to 1, like, it's totally conceivable that this happens. And then the sort of revival candidate here with Rick Carlisle, because Rick Carlisle actually did win Coach of the Year already in 2001, 2002. A lot of people forget. So multiple time winner, not impossible. This has happened already recently with Tom Thibodeau and Mike Brown, for example. So how do you become the revival candidate? You have to really overachieve with your team. When Rick Carlisle won this the first time, it was with the Detroit Pistons. So he wasn't even head coach of the Pacers yet, because he's had multiple runs as a head coach with the Pacers that people don't remember. But he was head coach of the Pistons in 01-02. This is before the Pistons became perennial contenders and won a title. Their win total that year was 30.5, and they won 50 that season with Rick Carlisle. So in order to do that again, win Coach of the Year again, I think they need to get to 57, 58 wins. I think they can do it based on offense because they're built to overachieve in the regular season. There could be some carryover. This is a generally young team as well that had some good playoff moments, including, and granted, it was against what was left of the Knicks roster, but they won a Game 7 in Madison Square Garden. And then they went out and had an entertaining series with the Celtics. They just couldn't close games. That was the big difference there. For young teams, that stuff can carry over. And if Tyrese Halliburton is going to be an MVP candidate, I don't think Tyrese Halliburton is going to win MVP. I think it's more realistic that Rick Carlisle wins Coach of the Year. So if I'm choosing between the two, and if I'm in on the Pacers, yeah, then at 30 to 1, I like Rick Carlisle as a sort of like, can this team make the leap that Oklahoma City has and that other teams have where they've produced the Coach of the Year award winner?
He won't face any resistance in the vote. Everyone loves Rick. He's cantankerous, but he's also like one of those guys who's been around forever. I've mentioned that I love the Pacers vibes. That I'm low on them from a year-over-year roster and what it looks like standpoint. But I am starting to get like a little bit more excited by the vibe that they're taking early on. We'll see how Media Day looks. I don't hate it. I can't get there with you on it just because I'm like, I just can't see a team with defense that poor in an offensive era winning that many games, winning enough games to beat out the other candidates. Like that's where I get hung up on it, but I understand the value of it. And Rick is a hell of a coach. And if the defense is any better, then we're like, even if they just get out of the bottom 10, if it's just like, hey, they have the number 1 offense and they have the number 18 defense, that's more than enough to get them within the conversation for it to be like, hey, what about Rick Carlisle? Let's jump over to Jim. Jim, this fucking Hawks team,
all right,
is the bane of basketball existence.
Hear me out here.
You cannot tell me they're going to be good defensively. What is the case here? I covered Quin Snyder in the G League. Okay? Like, I have a lot of affection for Quin Snyder. But tell me how the coach of this fucking Hawks team is going to win coach of the year.
It definitely starts with Hawks Island. We talked about how with these bets, you want to be a key component for, at least when I'm looking for these, for the most part. There actually are a couple interesting examples later of coaches where I wasn't on the island, but then when you do all of the formulas and see who pops, by these types of rules that we are looking at here, that actually it spits out some names that you have to at least think about. But started with Hawks Island, and Hawks Island to me comes down to a few things. First of all, this is a team that talent-wise, I think we can all agree underperformed last year. And I think maybe one of the we always say in a damning way, this was a team that was the worst against the spread record of all time, basically last year. Maybe they came up a few games short.
Third. They were the third worst team against the spread since we.
You want to hear the biggest silver lining reading of that of all time? That means that over and over again, the market's pretty smart. The market kept trusting them. It throughout they saw loss after loss, and they kept going back to the well.
Or the market's like me in college and keeps going back to people it should fucking know better to stay away from.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other reading of it. That is definitely the other reading of it. However, I do think there's some intrigue here, and I actually think that getting rid of DeJounte Murray and bringing in Larry Nance and Dyson Daniels, I actually think is going to be addition by subtraction. I actually really think that the defensive Larry Nance's defense, I think is going to be a pivotal part of this Hawks this improvement. He's not going to be worth 10 wins on his own, but if we get Trae Young healthy and in a backcourt where he doesn't have to defer to Murray, I think Murray did not fit with that Hawks team at all. We saw nothing worked from that at all. Bring in a couple of better defensive pieces for a team that has been historically bad defensively to the point where it can't get much worse. Jalen Johnson, a full season for a potential Most Improved Player of the Year award. This is one of the worst divisions in basketball. I think the Heat are going to be a lot worse. I think the Magic are obviously the favorites, and with good reason. And Mosley's an interesting case. He's just probably too short of a number, to be honest. But there are wins available in this East. They have no reason to tank whatsoever. Their picks are out the door. There's no reason for any losses here. They have every motivation to absolutely go for things here. Their preseason number here is coming in at 35.5. To get to that magical about 12 games of overperformance, it's 47 wins. That's not an insane number by any stretch of the imagination in the Eastern Conference. So what a very mediocre Miami Heat team did last season in the East. A strong coach like Quinn, a star player like Trae, if you get a full season out of him, and then I think a better defensive core around that star player who struggles defensively immensely. I think that there is a lot of intrigue on this team. I will say, I'll plug this one more time. This is going to get even more of an eye roll from you than my Larry Nance will make this defense good thing. Dennis Smith Jr. is still out there, and I want Dennis Smith Jr. in this backcourt. I think he would be the absolute perfect signing. If you're a Hawks fan and you are active on the Reddit, please go pester the Reddit. Start a ground swell uprising to get Dennis Smith Jr. on the Hawks. I'll be fully on board if they get him. It'd be a perfect fit.
Ground club movements never work. I think front offices deliberately will always reject the notion that the fans don't know fucking anything about anything. I love the DSJ idea a lot more than I love the Larry Nance one. Look, it's not that I think Nance was great 2 years ago. Last year, a lot of the metrics were pretty worrisome, and the injury concerns are pretty significant. Nance is a great defender when he's engaged and it's working. I also just you can at this point I'm you can throw Rudy Gobert on this team, and they're going to be 18th in defense. I have zero confidence that anything can pull this team into that level. But if you're right, you're right, and we can replay this clip into oblivion. Hit me with your other one of Mike Budenholzer. Give me the...
Yeah, I think this one's a lot... it'll be a lot briefer because it's a much easier case. They fit the perfect kind of window that we're looking at for mid-40s win totals. To make that jump into the high 50s is really not all that much of a stretch. This is a team that, for a while, I was very resistant on being on the Suns in any sort of way. Then they made a bunch of these, Tyus Jones signing. They brought in Monty Morris. They brought in these stable veterans I think are really going to improve a team that was very shallow, struggled with injuries a lot last season. Now, part of this is that the core guys they went out and got are a little bit injury prone, Bradley Beal in particular. But when if we're playing a ceiling team here, there's not too many ceilings more interesting in the NBA right now than the Phoenix Suns. Mike Budenholzer, proven coaching record again in terms of he's kind of fitting that really nice storyline we see over and over again, where a proven coach is in their first year with a new team and can improve that team. It's so easy to be like, oh, we know that guy. He's good. He's the reason that team improved. It's a very, very easy narrative to slip right into for a Suns team that I am annoyingly pretty high on. I was low on them all last season. And then when things came together at the end of the season, they were finally healthy. They looked like one of the better teams. Now in the postseason, Lord knows what happens there. That I think that was a matchup thing. When we did our postseason preview, we're like, I think the Suns, couldn't have landed in a worse spot for them, and that ended up to be true. But I think on a night to night basis, if they can stay relatively healthy, the ceiling of this team is really strong, and the case for Budenholzer fits very, very neatly. So when I saw his number was out there at plus 2,500, I think he should be much more in the tier of like the 14-1 tier of that top tier of coaches for this. And Bryan, we were talking a bit before this today about how it really is a wonky award, and to a certain degree, it feels like throwing darts. And I will say, I calculated the hold on one of the bigger books out there. There's a 19.49% hold on this market. So when it looks like, man, they just list every single coach at 10-1, and we somehow are betting into implied odds of 3,000%. It definitely is a high hold. However, we also talked about how a lot of these coaches just aren't viable options. Joe Mazzulla should not be among the favorites. Nick Nurse, who I think theoretically could be a really interesting candidate. The Sixers are going to have to win like 62 games to fit our qualifications here. Tibbs the Knicks would have to win like 62 games. A lot of these, when you actually look at them among the favorites, Dagnall is like the fifth favorite. We just said we've never had a back-to-back. That to me puts the value back in. You've got the crazy hold, you've got a little bit of a dartboard, but when the favorites are so mispriced, I think there is value down the board. And to me, Budenholzer is probably the most interesting. And for me personally, Quin Snyder is also a very interesting case to make.
Bud, I need to see it in preseason. I need to see how this fits. I have some concerns with the scheme fit with the guys that they have, but there's also a way in which I can imagine it working out really awesome. That Nurk playing drop gets him into the top 10. If he can get them to shoot more threes, okay. But I need to see that at this point. I don't trust them to do that. I have reached a best bet. I'm going to steal one. I'm going to steal the guy that Bryan was going to take. I'm taking Atkinson. Atkinson in the market is at 30-1. It's 47.5 on the win total. There's some 48.5s in the market. That's high, but we've seen guys do it before. It does mean I need to get them up to 60. The reason I'm going to go ahead and take it is Brandon and I talked about how much we like the Cavs, but it's a tough price. The division's plus 210. If the Cavaliers win the division, Kenny Atkinson is going to be a coach of the year candidate.
Yes.
I'm going to have at least CLV on it. Num, num, num. Love my CLV. But it's also CLV at 30-1. If he winds up in the top 2 or 3, gives us a little bit more options for portfolio betting down the line. And I do think of any team within this categorical range, the Cavaliers are the one I would single out as being like, that team could jump. And the voters are so resistant to Donovan Mitchell, I'm not worried about the MVP drag. Because they're always kind of like, yeah, no, Donovan's really good. What a star. I mean, he's not that good. And I'm always like, but he's got the numbers and the wins. And they're always like, yeah, but like he's not that good. And so it's so I don't worry about that. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna grab Kenny Atkinson 30-1. Let's do rapid fire. Fonseca, give me a list of guys that you're interested in but not betting now. Oh,
what if the Charlotte Hornets win 45 games?
I thought this too. I looked at the board and was Charles Lee, king of the vibes. I had it like, I was like, oh, I thought, go ahead, but I thought about it.
the Hornets win total is 30.5. So this is why I'm saying 45 wins. Maybe it gets you a 6 seed. You might be the 7 seed and still in the play-in, but I think everyone thinks Charlotte's going to be not good again. Charles Lee was an assistant with the Celtics, won a title. Was an assistant with the Bucks, won a title. Was an assistant with the Hawks. There was a 60-win team in there somewhere. Like he's been on some good coaching staffs, right? Brandon Miller, I'm intrigued as to what that can sort of become. LaMelo Ball, I'm open-minded. Is what I'll say.
If he's healthy,
if he's healthy, like I still have questions, and then also the division, because 16 games are going to come in this division. Jim already talked about the division. Yeah. The Wizards are going to be ass.
Yes.
The Hawks might be ass. We don't know. Like the Heat. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. Who knows?
I just don't. I don't know. They'll probably be in the play-in again, but I don't know definitively. And the Magic, what if we're too high on the Orlando Magic?
Yeah, that's fair.
Like, I love their defense. I love the KCP acquisition. I think Kentavious Caldwell-Pope's going to be good there. But I think we all kind of wanted them to get a point guard, maybe Darius Garland, somebody like that. And there's still a question mark there. And Coach Mosley's one of the favorites for this award. And it's like, what if we're too high on Orlando? Like their win total, because I was looking at, okay, is this even worth betting the over at this point? And their win total is at fucking 48.5. I'm like, all right, like, can we calm down a little bit? So there's some of that in there. And then I'm just looking at the Eastern Conference, and the Eastern Conference, I don't think it's bad. I do think it's a little top heavy. And there's going to be some weird shit going on in that 4 to 12 range that we should probably be prepared for. And I'm like, hey, like Charles Lee he's been on some damn good coaching staffs. Like, what if? And I have one more in this same sort of vein, because listen, we've gotten multiple times within the last few years, guys whose win total projections, teams whose win total projections were like Knicks 21. They had a coach of the year with 41 wins and 57% wins. And that basically adjusts to an 82 game season, 47 and 35. Mike Brown was a 48 win team. So is there another team in that regard? In the Western Conference, it was harder to find one, but I looked at Will Hardy with the Utah Jazz. Okay. There's already been a Will Hardy season where the Jazz were projected to win 23 games and they won 37. So I'm like,
I think they're pretty locked into Cooper Flag.
I would agree with that, but I'm just saying, like,
keep an eye on it.
He's one that I looked at, just because I think he's a really good coach. But there's a world where they just come out slow, start selling off parts or whatever. I wouldn't bet him yet. I probably feel better about the Charles Lee one, but I don't know if I'm going to do that either yet.
We need a wrap for time, but Jim, give me a rapid fire list of the guys that you
Steve Kerr was one that we very briefly mentioned. He's out there at 40-1. They fit that tier of 40 wins, like low 40s last year, low 40s win total, and I'm very high on them this season. Another one, Taylor Jenkins, you mentioned. I think everyone being so high on Memphis has kind of boosted that win total up. I think that could be one where, say they win 55, we break the rules a little bit. Ime Udoka on Rockets Island, but it's just too short of a number for me. Willie Green is one that I think is very interesting because of the ceiling of the Pelicans. I like to play crazy Pelican ceilings that way. And then the one who popped, of the weirdest one that popped to me, was Darko out in Toronto. I don't like this team at all, but they could very easily win 43 games. They were good with their 4 healthy players. If they win 43 games in the East, and that's the 6th seed somehow, because the East is just terrible, that could be a pretty easy narrative case. He's a really long number. I don't think I like it, but at being out in Toronto, sometimes you got to think about, like, if I'm wrong. Brandon always like, if I'm wrong, and Toronto is just like actually like kind of a decent team this year. He's like an early, he's like kind of a creative whiz coach who's new to the team. He popped to me as, I've never thought about Toronto this offseason. I like their under, actually. But if I'm wrong, their ceiling is actually kind of intriguing, and this would be the way to play it.
This is another, I'm going to wait for preseason. But I will say mine actually, because like I think the ceiling's too low for Darko. I like the vibes very much out of Sacramento. There is a feeling I'm hearing of like loading up for this season, and that to me translates as a really great regular season. Fox, Sabonis, DeRozan, those guys are good enough to win you 50-plus games, but not good enough to hurt your case for Coach of the Year. He's a previous winner, which, again, we've seen a lot of previous winners, but he didn't win last year. Bounce back season, got the extension. Mike Brown puts it all together. The defense takes a step forward. Mike Brown, 30-1. Not a bad option, I don't think, either. Our best bets, Jim Turvey is going with Quin Snyder and Mike Budenholzer. Brian Fonseca's got Rick Carlisle. And I'm going to take Kenny Atkinson for best bet. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back all this week with more coverage of NBA Awards Week. We'll have lots of stuff for you. We'll have Most Improved Player. Jim and I are going to do Clutch Player. Lots of stuff to get to. You can follow Brian on Twitter at Bryan Fonseca NY, and in the Action Network app, Jim Turvey's at Turvey Bets. Thanks for joining us. My thanks to David Payne and Tito Benach for taking care of us on the production side. We'll see you guys again next time. Till then, let's get buckets.